Starting a high-performance reciprocating aircraft engine takes finesse. Meanwhile, starting a turbine engine is very procedural. But they both require a knowledge of the underlying systems. We'll start with the reciprocating engines because I suspect they'll give people more trouble. Nobody ever said starting almost 400 horsepower of turning metal would be easy. Start by assessing the temperature of the engines. If they're well below freezing, you might have to use the propane heater to raise the temperature of the engines for starting. This is discussed in another video. This aircraft also has a great feature for starting called a pre-oiler. It's an electric oil pump that injects oil directly to the top of the crankcase galleries. It's said that almost all damage done to aircraft engines is while starting, and this helps reduce that by providing extra lubrication. On the engine visualizer, we can see the viscosity of the oil expressed by its color. This affects how quickly the oil moves through the engine galleries when pressurized by either the pre-oiler or the engine-driven pump. Watch the oil travel through the galleries on its way back to the sump. We want about 15 psi of oil pressure on the gauge before starting the engine. In colder conditions, you may have to tap the gauge to get a more accurate reading. While the pre-oiler is running, we can prime the engine. Set the mixture to full rich and the throttle fully open. Then turn on the fuel pump. We can watch the fuel travel out of the tanks through the electric fuel pump into the fuel injection servo and then out to the distribution manifold and into each cylinder. You only need to run the pump until there's visible fuel inside the cylinders for starting. In fact, running it much longer runs the risk of flooding the engine, after which we would have to start at an advanced throttle setting to create a combustible fuel-to-air mixture. Once the engine is primed, we can begin cranking. As we turn the ignition switch to both, we can see the magnetos unground in sequence. When we turn the switch to start, the starter motor torque will be calculated based on the battery temperature, the starter temperature, the bus voltage, the oil viscosity, too many parameters to count. As it rotates the propeller, we'll see it fall into each compression well for every cylinder. We'll hear the magneto impulse couplings snap as they move the wiper to each contact, and if we're lucky, it might just start. If not, we should use our hardware to hold down the starter and move the throttle up and down in the bottom region of its travel. This will almost certainly guarantee a start as long as there's fuel in the cylinders. Once the engine is running, try to keep the RPM between 1,000 and 1,200. This will keep the engine warm enough to prevent the buildup of carbon and lead deposits on the spark plugs, known as fouling. If you advance the throttles to full on takeoff and the engine begins to sputter and backfire, you almost certainly have a bad case of engine fouling. You can taxi off the runway, pull the mixtures back, and try to increase the heat inside the engine to melt these deposits off the spark plugs. If this doesn't work, of course, you have a button on the tablet display labeled Clean Plugs. If the engine becomes flooded while you're trying to start it, press the Clear Cylinders button to start over. If you're having trouble starting the engines and running the starter continuously, you may also need the Repair Starter and Recharge Battery buttons. If the starter becomes disconnected from the electrical system due to overuse and overheating, it will turn red, just like the generator. You can also monitor the temperature of the battery on this screen or using the gauge on the panel. One of the worst aspects of operating fuel-injected engines, despite their advantages, is vapor lock. This is a frequent frustration of even real-world pilots. When an engine has recently been running, it's hot enough to vaporize the liquid fuel in the fuel injection system, causing a back pressure that prevents the injection of new fuel into the cylinders for priming. While vapor lock is invisible to a real-world pilot, we have a tablet interface that shows us vapor back pressure in thick red lines. To start a vapor-locked engine, cool fuel from the fuel lines and tanks should be circulated through the fuel injector manifold, with the throttle and mixtures at their fully closed positions. After a few seconds of running the pumps, the red lines should begin to recede, and we can start the engine normally as soon as we have new fuel in the cylinders. Be very careful not to flood the engines at this point, or else we'll have to pull out a whole other checklist. To illustrate that no two engine starts are ever the same, here's a montage of starts at different temperatures and configurations. There's a whole other slew of issues that come with operating a turbocharged aircraft. One I might mention is that beyond the critical altitude, a rapid reduction of throttle setting can actually choke out the engine and mimic a complete engine failure. These have been discussed in other Black Square videos and are handled in their entirety in the manual that comes with this product. Just know that Black Square's turbocharger simulation is still the most realistic for Microsoft Flight Simulator. When you advance the throttles on takeoff and hear the turbochargers, they're spooling up, increasing manifold pressure and providing pressurized air to the cabin. So much is simulated, almost anything can go wrong. Before we move on to the turbine-powered aircraft, one of the other advantages of this robust engine starting physics is that it also creates realistic engine feathering and air starts. When the engine is shut down, it continues to windmill until we pull the propeller lever into feather. This must be done quickly to overcome the feather-locking flyweights, which usually engage during a normal engine shutdown. We can watch on the engine visualizer as oil moves from the propeller hub back into the sump, slowly changing the blade pitch. As the aerodynamic forces are reduced on the propeller, it slowly comes to a stop, finally resting in one of the compression wells. In order to restart the engine, we can try running the starter motor, but with the aerodynamic forces resisting the rotation of the propeller in feather, it will probably not get the RPM that it needs to start. In many aircraft, our only other option is to pitch down, losing valuable altitude while we try to get the propeller to windmill out of that first compression well. Luckily, in this aircraft, we have unfeathering accumulators. They are hydraulic accumulators that build up pressurized oil while the engine is running and save it just for this moment. When we move the propeller lever out of feather, oil is transferred from the accumulator into the propeller hub, unfeathering the prop and starting it windmilling. The only caveat is that this can only be done once before there's not enough oil pressure to feather the propeller again, leaving it stuck in its highest drag configuration. For this reason, it's best to only use the unfeathering accumulator when you know for certain that the engine is going to restart. Starting a turbine aircraft may seem simple in comparison to its reciprocating engine counterparts. And it is, but there's a lot to go wrong, and it's very expensive when it does. The primary concern when starting a free turbine is gas generator speed. This is the mass airflow moving through the engine that helps keep internal temperatures low. We can also help the gas generator by positioning the aircraft into the wind. This reduces any back pressure on the exhaust pipes and helps move more air through the engine. PT6 engines usually have an upper temperature limit, which shouldn't be exceeded for more than a few seconds while starting, and then an upper limit, which should never be exceeded. Doing so is a several $100,000 mistake. So when should we admit fuel into the engine? Simply whenever gas generator RPM stabilizes at its maximum possible value. No book will tell you what that is, however, because it's different on every flight. The primary influence on gas generator RPM is battery performance and voltage. We can keep the voltage high by using the external power cart, which helps absorb the voltage drop when the starter motor is engaged. Temperature also has a large impact on battery performance and the efficiency of the bearings that hold the gas generator turbine. The engine should be able to start safely down to frigid, almost Arctic temperatures, but at that point, you might want to consider using the propane heater. Let's begin starting the engine by turning on the primary fuel pump, which will supply pressurized fuel to the fuel control unit as a hydraulic working fluid. On its way, it travels through a fuel filter, which can become clogged, indicating red on this screen and illuminating an annunciator on the panel. This will reduce the power output of the engine. We can also see oil moving through the lines up to the propeller governor and into the reduction gearbox sump. Once the gas generator has stabilized at its highest RPM, we can move the condition lever to on. Once the engine has lit off, we can see flame in the combustion chamber near the igniters. Soon thereafter, the secondary injectors will kick in, raising the RPM further. Internal temperatures peak around only 700 degrees Celsius. Once temperatures have peaked and the gas generator RPM reaches around 50%, we can disengage the starter motor. Just like the reciprocating engine visualizer, components that fail will turn red. Fuel control unit failures can shut down the primary or secondary injectors in flight, severely reducing the power output of the engine. The high pressure and low pressure P2.5 bleed valves can also fail in the open or closed positions. These help regulate the output of the engine during low power settings. The pressurization valves on this screen should look familiar, given that this is a modification of the factory aircraft. We now also have an oil cooler door, which should be open for starting and when operating on the ground in mild conditions, and closed at altitude or in frigid temperatures. Lastly, another feature that was previously invisible on Black Square's TBM 850 is the FOD damage model. FOD stands for Foreign Object Debris. We can encounter many different types of FOD, from water and ice in flight to highly abrasive sand on the ground. Use this screen to help you judge whether the inertial separators should be on or off to help protect the engine from damaging particulate. Finally, I'll leave you with another montage of turbine engine starts so that you can see that no two are the same. I hope you're now ready to start the engines on your new black square Dukes for Microsoft Flight Simulator. There's always more to learn, and a 160-page manual to take you through the entire process. And don't forget to watch the other videos on this aircraft. Until then, I'll see you in the next video.